You're listening to Out Front with Family Forward, a podcast designed to bridge the gap between research and real-world parenting by providing insights into how early life experiences can shape a child's future. Join us as we explore the spectrum of family life and equip you with the knowledge to make a positive impact on your family's journey, one episode at a time. Welcome to Out Front with Family Forward. This is our second season, and this is episode 2. And we are focusing on all things resilience with my co-host for today, Dr. Ashley Wagner. She is the director of our occupational therapy program in the Developmental Trauma Center. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks, Sharon.
And we are going to talk all things kids and resilience today. Mm-hmm. And to be clear, this is probably one of my favorite topics because I have been in the field for 30 years, working specifically with kids, especially kids that have complex trauma histories. And I will say that in the decades of my work, one of the most common things I ran into was, well, this trauma happened when they were very young, when they were 1, they were 2. So there's no possible way they can remember. So there's no possible way all of the big behaviors that we're seeing now can in any way, shape, or form be from the early adversity. So I think fortunately the science has come along, and I think the science has well established that, you know, just because there was adversity, abuse, trauma, neglect, pre-verbally, that doesn't mean that there's no impact. It actually means there is a significant impact because it is that felt impact, right? It is an embodied impact. And we see that in adults, even with trauma and, you know, significant adversity. So the science is there. The science has caught up. But, you know, the kids we see at Family Forward, you know, how that's showing up, there can be impacts in their ability to regulate their bodies, which causes problems with school. There can be sensory processing challenges that make it hard to pay attention. There's issues with motor planning that might impact things like hygiene. We were just talking about some concepts related to that in a consultation group. Like hygiene can often be an issue with kids that have trauma histories, and it could be something like motor planning. So as we connect these dots and as we kind of pull in that occupational therapy lens, what does building resiliency look like for a child?
You know, when you first introduced this topic, when we landed on this topic, as we were like preparing for this podcast, I felt myself getting kind of passionate about it because this is exactly something that I hear as the caregiver of the parent of 3 kids who have had a history of trauma. Right. All the time. But kids are so resilient. Yeah. And it's almost weaponized. Absolutely. You know, in the sense that, you know, it kind of discredits all of the things that they continue to experience as a result that you were just speaking to, right? And I often respond with the idea of, you know, resilience isn't really this innate trait. Right. And I heard you and Jamie were talking about this in the last episode, right? It's not this individual trait or strength or anything like that. Resilience really is responding to the environment, to the system that you're in, to the context, in a way that allows you to continue to engage in a meaningful way. And so, you know, from occupational therapy lens, we're really looking at those activities and we're looking at how can a child engage in activities in a way that is meaningful, valuable to them, that lets them feel successful, right? And when we're thinking about resiliency, the thing that I often come back to when I'm speaking about, you know, children who've experienced trauma and resiliency is, you know, kids are resilient. That is 100% true. Right. But they're not resilient in the sense that they then have no impact. Right. They're not resilient in the sense that you can't see a difference after this ongoing trauma. They're resilient in the sense that their brains are adapting to the environment that is repeatedly causing these trauma exposures. And so their brain is adapting for survival.
Right.
And their brain is adapting so that they can engage within that environmental context. But when we take them out of that context that doesn't meet their needs, when we take them out of that context that repeatedly makes choices that they wouldn't make for themselves, and we put them into this context where kids are generally expected to trust that their needs will be met, to trust that somebody in control will make a good choice for them. When we take them out of this environment where their brains have resiliently learned that that's not the case, and we say, but now you're in a new environment, we expect you to act like every other kid is expected to act.
Right.
And I think that's the problem. You know, in occupational therapy, we think about engagement and activities, and we don't think about it in the sense of, can they engage in an activity like everyone else? Because no one engages in activities the same way as everyone else.
Right.
You know, and I think that is a misnomer that we need to kind of throw out, right? This idea of resilience is recovering.
Right.
Meaning that they are getting over something. And the truth is that when we're thinking of recovering, it's not getting back to something the exact same way that we did it before. Recovering is reclaiming a sense of autonomy or a sense of value from engagement.
Yeah, let's hammer on that. Let's go back to, because I think it's so important. The kids are resilient.
Absolutely.
The fact that they survived in situations of such challenge, such inconsistency, the lack of potential, supportive caregiving, but perhaps still with, supportive people along the way. Those kids showed amazing resiliency, right? The resiliency isn't let's scale back and take back those skills that actually help them survive. Right. And that's one of the, going back to kind of the Mythbuster things, like that's kind of a myth we have with children is that they are, one, born resilient. And then when they have adapted to survive a situation, like those skills then are actually the resiliency.
Yeah.
And it is disenfranchising and disempowering, I think, when we start to pathologize those things. And we talked a little bit about that with the Connection series as well. But it gets into really dangerous territory, especially when the, I think, traditional lens for, building resilience or recovering from adversity is, what is your narrative? Tell your story. I was just having some thoughts just about, court systems want kids to, tell their story. And it's like, oh, they're so strong because they have to, they're kind of forced at times, I think, to create narratives that isn't actually resiliency building.
Yeah. Yes. Let's stop the narrative of resiliency is somebody fitting into a system that doesn't work for them without making other people around them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I agree with that. And it's so interesting. Occupational therapy historically has been in more of a medical setting, right? And one of the things, I used to work with a lot of clients with spinal cord injury. And a lot of times we would talk about the fact that they would come in, what's the very first thing somebody with spinal cord injury says they want to work on? When we ask them, walking. Every single time. And it would be a lot of nurturing this idea of, it might not be walking how you get around, but I promise you, we'll figure out a way for you to get around.
Right.
And I think that we need to generalize that idea, and not that people with physical disabilities don't continue to experience a disparity in how they're treated or how the environment accommodates them. Absolutely they are, and we need better accessibility in our society. But we need to generalize from that physical disability idea to mental health and to the wellness for people who've experienced trauma, and think, okay, so you might not do things exactly how the system expects you to do things. And instead, we need to adapt this system. We need to create accessibility so that if a child is having a meltdown in Target, that the environment around them isn't sending in security guards to ask that caregiver, everything okay here? Which I've had happen. And it makes parenting so challenging when you are trying to parent a child in a different way because your child processes the environment differently, but the environment is not adapting for that. And then you're kind of bumping into the walls of the system repeatedly, and it just doesn't work.
Well, and that goes back to what are our expectations around things like resiliency? Like, what are the narratives that, we talked about in the last episode? These are internalized narratives. So some of those myths, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that is an internalized narrative. Like, you need to pull it together. You need to suck it up. And we often tell that to our kids, right? When we know, right? So if we know better, we do better. Resiliency building is kind of riding the wave of those things, right? So when you have a kiddo who has adapted a skill set for survival that, like you're saying, doesn't fit into many other places, where do you start? How do you start in the home to build up some of those needed skills so they can internalize those?
Yeah, and I think that in occupational therapy at FamilyForward, a lot of times the place we start is actually with the caregiver's attunement. Right? It's the caregiver's ability to recognize patterns within the environment and within their child, and so that they can then shift their response in response to what is happening with the child. I think an example from my own family is one of my kids is somebody who needs a lot of sleep.
Yeah.
More sleep than most kids. My kiddo needs 9 hours a night or we don't do so well.
I feel that.
Right. Yeah, right? Yes. And just the other night, my child stayed up till 1 a.m. reading, and I did not realize this until the last day. Although, as the parent of a teenager, if them staying up late reading is the hardest thing I'm dealing with, we're doing okay, right? But they stayed up till 1 a.m. reading, and I knew that this was not going to go well. Historically, when my child was younger, they would have just really big fits if they got less than that 9 hours of sleep. And so this day, they're waking up and they're saying, I got about 5 hours. And I'm like, oh, this is not going to go well. But my child showed amazing resiliency because what actually happened is, when she was younger, I was able to note this pattern.
Yeah.
And I was able to teach her, when you are sleep deprived, you need to actively work on self-care. Because if you don't actively work on making sure you're eating enough, if you don't actively work on making sure that you're in situations where you're going to feel secure and safe, then you are going to take it out on everyone around you, and there's going to be relational damage as a result of that.
Right.
And so this time when it happened, we had already practiced those skills. And the resiliency that came from it was, I knew the pattern. And so I was able to say, today's going to be a tough day for you. Here's what you can expect. You're going to have big emotional responses to everything that happens. And here are the tools I can give you for that situation. And my child showed resiliency because she was able to then say, okay, I hear what you're saying. And by the way, this was after probably 1 or 2 big blow-up emotional things, right? Right. Let's not idealize this.
Right.
But, she was able to say, yes, I do recognize this. I am sorry for those big blow-ups. And I will make sure that I eat my breakfast this morning before I go to school, that I do this to take care of myself. And we were able to get through the day. And was it an incredibly pretty day? No. There were definitely things that would have been much better if they'd been a little differently. But the resilience came from the fact that we were able to use those tools, that I was able to attune to her. She was able to use the tools when she needed them. And she was able to get through the day with some dysregulation. But she was able to return the following day to a sleep schedule. She was able to return to her typical activities. But, the fact that our family system was resilient. I texted my wife. I was on the way to school, and because, there'd been kind of this big blow up between my wife and my daughter. And I said, this is not the time to resolve this. This is just a reminder, we gotta just get her through the day, and we will focus on the issues we had tomorrow. And that's what we did. And our system was resilient because we were able to attune, recognize what was going on, change what we were able to do so that it was just this tiny little divot of an issue, as opposed to she didn't go to school, as opposed to we have a broken front door, as opposed to, we had to miss a day of work to stay home and help her, which are things that have happened in the past.
Yeah. Well, and that's the role and the importance of co-regulation, right?
Absolutely.
So attunement, being able to read the room. Can I look at my kid? Are there predictable cues? Not 100% perfection, but are there pretty predictable cues that I can okay, this is the story that's starting to form right here. Yeah. And what are the resources that I have? Because guess what? That's resiliency building. So your kiddo along the way internalizes these little moments that will carry them in as they move through adulthood. Then they become the adults that are able to say, I need to check in internally. I know my sleep was messed up. Or, maybe they develop some, I guess, resiliency around even sleep disruptions, like they can handle it. Whatever it is, that's the resiliency building stuff. Yeah. And, as you're talking, I was thinking of my own kiddo when she was younger, and she really had a difficult time, speaking out in the classroom. And like you were mentioning before, there are a lot of spaces that just everybody has to act the same. So the middle school did not do a great job of seeing, my kiddo for who she was and what her strengths were, but instead kind of continue to pull on and kind of pick at the things she didn't do, because you need to be able to talk in front of the class. You need to be able to raise your hand and ask questions. You should be able to do all these things. And, the conversation was but what if she's just okay the way she is? Right. How many other ways does she show you that she's understanding the content, that she's really bright, and that she actually understands what you're talking about? Yeah. Well, all these other ways. Okay, well then why do we keep picking at? Because that works against her feeling resilient and empowered, right? So all that did was kind of exacerbate this kind of anxiety about, speaking in front of people, raising her hand. It actually made her feel less brave and less able to take a risk, right? Right. So we see these things all the time. It's just a compare and contrast of two different ways. Both kids super amazing and bright, obviously, because they're our kids, right? But you can see that, when you have a pattern, when you can cue into some things, there is a way to build resiliency. The ability to internalize coping mechanisms, to be able to internalize and lean on my support system. And there are ways to peck at it and actually diminish the capacity for resiliency by kind of forcing people into, round pegs into square holes, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is really kind of the thing that I would want to message is that when we're working on resiliency in occupational therapy, we are not, I think a lot of people envision that we're in there somehow fixing how kids respond to different situations.
Well, making them respond correctly.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's not really what it is.
Right.
We're not in there somehow chiseling out a resilient child,
This is going to come as a shock to our listeners, I'm sure. And I know it's a shock to me. You're not just chiseling out resilient children.
We're not just chiseling out.
Big news here on Out Front with Family Forward. Breaking news.
Right. What we're actually doing, though, is we're creating these pathways for them to get through the challenges.
Right.
We're giving them alternatives. Instead of throwing something, maybe we're going to teach them to take deep breaths and then ask for help. Instead of, getting into physical altercations with their caregivers, we're going to teach the caregiver and the child how to interact together in a way that gets them to that next point. And I think one of the things that is so challenging with this is that they're not just the kids are expected to have certain responses, but the caregivers are too. And I know that there's going to be conversation in the next episode about caregiver resilience, right? But I think that there really is this important piece of caregivers feel this pressure of, when I'm out in public and my child does have a breakdown, that I have to look like I'm doing something.
Right.
I have to have this performance of, being the caregiver that's on top of everything, and I think there's so much, giving yourself a break, so that you can just caregive and parent for your child, what your child needs in that moment with your child. I was talking with a friend one time about the fact that sometimes doing trauma-informed parenting feels a lot like kind of coddling.
Yeah.
Because it isn't just harping on, well, you shouldn't have done this. You know, I remember one time my child got really angry right before we were supposed to leave for another child's birthday party. And they like slammed the car door. I think they might have even like run into the street a little bit. And after I got them back to a calm place and we were calm and we were talking, and I figured out that my response had also elevated the situation, I remember thinking, okay, I'm supposed to say they can't go to the birthday party now. And I remember having this internal battle of society says if my child acts in a way that isn't socially appropriate, they should have a consequence.
Must have the consequence.
Must have the consequence, should not go to the birthday party. And my brain said, but if you do this, they will learn that their behavior and their responses mean they shouldn't have friends. And I remember like thinking that so clearly in my brain. And I decided, you know what? They will have a consequence. I can't remember what the consequence was, but it wasn't not going to the birthday party.
Right.
Because I needed them to see, okay, I'm not going to isolate you because of what happened. And we are going to work on this together. And the resiliency is really thinking that long-term picture. Okay, long term, how am I going to build these skills? Long term, how am I going to equip them with the strategies and the tools they need so that when I'm not there, they can make safe choices. They can make choices that enrich their lives. And I think that thinking long term with resilience is so important, giving them the strategies so that they can, deal with incidental things that come up.
Well, and actually, the part of resiliency building, you made a mistake. And we can't even say in that moment that your child used poor judgment, right? Because we know that once that survival system kind of hijacks, they are in survival mode.
Oh, yeah.
And it is fight, flight, freeze, flock, or fawn, right? So that's kind of where they're at. So the template for parenting is, yes, there must be a consequence. And the logical one is, well, you acted this way now, so now you're not going to the party. But man, what a powerful opportunity to internalize. You can make a mistake and there'll be a lesson learned, but you can still go to the party.
Yeah.
Like we don't really have to pull the whole rug out all the time. And I think sometimes if we even pause and we ask ourselves, like, what actually is the lesson that we're teaching right now, other than don't make mistakes, or you can't have the next step, which is irrelevant to the meltdown, right? It is the opportunity to make friends. It is the opportunity to, explore and enjoy a party. Like there's lots of benefits to something like that. And there is a lot of pressure, but man, what a great opportunity for, again, resiliency building in our kiddos.
Well, and I think too, it was important for me to remember that was a time when my child's brain had flipped over to fight or flight. Right? And that flip to fight or flight is my child's resiliency.
Exactly.
That is their brain responding to what they had experienced before they came to me, and probably some situations that really their brain needed that.
Right.
And so I think that remembering that and remembering that we don't want a message to a child that their brain is broken and therefore they shouldn't have friends or they shouldn't have good things happening.
Well, and there's a consequence when your survival skill kicks in, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, again, so much to unpack, I think, when it comes to resiliency building with our kiddos. But this conversation, I think, is such a great jumpstart for people to really start thinking about what are these little moments when you feel like everything's tipped up. Is there a different decision I can make in this particular moment, right? What is the end game for me? If I might be dysregulated, my kid is dysregulated, can we take a pause and say, is this an opportunity for that resiliency building, which is what we want for our kids. Resiliency building, again, even with kids, we have to expect that when things get kerfuffled, when things really blow up, they're going to have a reaction to it. Resiliency isn't not having a reaction.
Right.
So, how do we seize that as an opportunity as parents? And like I said, like you mentioned, we'll talk a lot more about that in the next episode when we talk about caregiving. We're going to have a great guest, Dr. Nancy Weaver, on that one to really unpack that parental caregiver piece. So this has been great, Ashley. Any parting thoughts for our listeners today from you?
The last thought I would leave is that Blostein actually has this beautiful quote that I come to a lot in occupational therapy, and it's that our role in supporting kids is to help them develop a sense of agency over their arousal states. And I think that speaks to that resiliency. Is what we really want is to help kids to feel a sense of agency over what they're experiencing so that they can then move forward with that sense that it's not just all out of control and they're just responding to things that are being thrown at them randomly.
Yeah, they can exhibit some resilience when they're faced with stress and adversity. I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashley. This has been a fantastic conversation, and we will see you all next time for episode 3, where we talk about caregiver engagement and caregiver resiliency. Thank you for listening to Out Front with Family Forward. For more information and resources to support you and your family, visit FamilyForwardMO.org.